My father died on a cold Tuesday morning. His name was Richard Bennett, and for 42 years, he had lived in the same two-story house where my brother Daniel and I had grown up. To everyone else, it was just an old house. To us, it was everything. The kitchen still had the scratches we made as children. The backyard still had the apple tree Dad planted when I was 8. And upstairs, my old bedroom still had the faded marks on the wall where Dad had measured my height every birthday. After his funeral, Daniel was the one who kept saying, "Don't worry, Emily, I'll take care of everything." I trusted him. That was my first mistake. I lived 3 hours away and couldn't stay long after the funeral. Daniel lived in the same town, so I assumed he would handle the practical things while I dealt with my grief. A week later, I called him. "How are things at the house?" His answer was strangely quick. "Fine, you don't need to worry about it." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Dad's gone. We need to move on." I felt something cold in my stomach. "Daniel, what are you talking about?" There was a pause. Then he said, "I sold the house." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I thought he was joking. "You what?" "I sold Dad's house." My hands started shaking. "You couldn't have sold it. It was Dad's." Daniel sighed. "Emily, Dad is dead. The house belonged to both of us. Then why didn't you tell me?" Another pause. "Because I knew you'd make it complicated." That sentence hurt more than the sale itself. I asked him for the details. He refused. He said everything had been handled legally and that my share of the money would be sent to me soon. But something wasn't right. Dad had always been extremely careful about his finances. And 6 months before his death, he had told me something I couldn't forget. "Emily, if anything ever happens to me, don't let Daniel rush you into signing anything." At the time, I thought Dad was simply worried about us arguing over the house. Now, I wasn't so sure. I drove back to town the next morning. When I arrived at the house, a moving truck was sitting in the driveway. A stranger was carrying my father's furniture outside. I ran toward Daniel. "What is happening?" He barely looked at me. "The buyers are taking possession." I stared at him. "You really sold it?" "Yes." "Without telling me?" "You weren't here. That doesn't give you the right." Daniel rolled his eyes. "Emily, everything had been handled legally and that my share of the money would be sent to me soon." But something wasn't right. Dad had always been extremely careful about his finances. And 6 months before his death, he had told me something I couldn't forget. "Emily, if anything ever happens to me, don't let Daniel rush you into signing anything." At the time, I thought Dad was simply worried about us arguing over the house. Now, I wasn't so sure. I drove back to town the next morning. When I arrived at the house, a moving truck was sitting in the driveway. A stranger was carrying my father's furniture outside. I ran toward Daniel. "What is happening?" He barely looked at me. "The buyers are taking possession." I stared at him. "You really sold it?" "Yes." "Without telling me?" "You weren't here. That doesn't give you the right." Daniel rolled his eyes. "Emily, everything had been handled legally and that my share of the money would be sent to me soon." At 6 months before his death, he had told me something I couldn't forget. "Emily, if anything ever happens to me, don't let Daniel rush you into signing anything." At the time, I thought Dad was simply worried about us arguing over the house. Now, I wasn't so sure. I drove back to town the next morning. When I arrived at the house, a moving truck was sitting in the driveway. A stranger was carrying my father's furniture outside. "Sent to me soon." But something wasn't right. Dad had always been extremely careful about his finances. And 6 months before his death, he had told me something I couldn't forget. "Emily, if anything ever happens to me, don't let Daniel rush you into signing anything." At the time, I thought Dad was simply worried about us arguing over the house. Now I wasn't so sure. I drove back to town the next morning. When I arrived at the house, a moving truck was sitting in the driveway. A stranger was carrying my father's furniture outside. I ran toward Daniel. "What is happening?" He barely looked at me. "The buyers are taking possession." I stared at him. You really sold it? Yes. Without telling me? You weren't here. That doesn't give you the right. Daniel rolled his eyes. Stop being dramatic. You'll get your money. Then he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a check. My share. Except the amount was nowhere near what half of the house should have been worth. I looked at Daniel. This is wrong. He smiled. No, Emily. What's wrong is you thinking Dad left you some special claim to this house. I wanted to argue, but then I remembered Dad's warning. Don't let Daniel rush you into signing anything. I hadn't signed anything. So how had Daniel sold the house? I went home that night with one question burning in my mind. How did my brother legally sell a house that belonged to both of us? 3 days later, while I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I answered. Hello? A man's voice replied. Is this Emily Bennett? Yes. My name is Jonathan Miller. I'm the attorney who handled your father's estate. My heart stopped. I'm sorry, but I don't understand. He took a breath. Emily, there's something you need to know. What? I've just reviewed the documents concerning your father's house. He paused. And your brother was never supposed to be able to sell it. I couldn't speak. Then he said something that changed everything. Your father left the house to you. For several seconds, I couldn't say a word. I was still holding the phone against my ear when Jonathan, my father's lawyer, repeated himself. Emily, your father left the family home entirely to you. I stared at the check Daniel had given me. The amount suddenly looked even more insulting. But how? I finally asked. Daniel sold the house 3 days ago. I know. Then how could he sell something that belonged to me? He couldn't, not legally. My heart started pounding. Jonathan explained that my father had changed his will 8 months before his death. The original will had divided everything equally between Daniel and me. But the new will was different. Dad had left his savings and investments to Daniel, and the house, the one thing Daniel had always wanted, was left entirely to me. Why would Dad do that? I whispered. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Because he knew something you didn't. What? I think you should come to my office. The next morning, I drove to his office. Jonathan placed a thick folder on his desk. This is your father's updated estate file. I opened it. There was Dad's signature. There was the date, and beneath it was a handwritten note. I recognized his handwriting immediately. Emily, if you're reading this, something happened that I couldn't tell you while I was alive. Trust Jonathan. Do not trust Daniel. My eyes filled with tears. Dad had known. Jonathan continued. Your father also told me that Daniel had been pressuring him to sell the house. I shook my head. That sounds like Daniel. He wanted the money to pay off several debts. I looked up. How much? Jonathan slid another document toward me. I nearly dropped it. Daniel owed almost $180,000. Credit cards, personal loans, gambling debts. He had been hiding all of it from our father. But there was something even worse. Jonathan pointed to another document. 6 months before your father's death, Daniel attempted to convince him to sign a power of attorney. My stomach turned. Did Dad sign it? No. Then how did Daniel sell the house? Jonathan leaned back. That is the question we're trying to answer. He showed me a copy of the sale documents. I merely proved you this in memoriam on Lily. Then how did Daniel sell the house? Jonathan leaned back. That is the question we're trying to answer. He showed me a copy of the sale documents. There it was, a power of attorney bearing my father's name. But I immediately noticed something. That isn't Dad's handwriting. Jonathan nodded. I agree. I looked at him. You think Daniel forged it? We need to prove it. Suddenly, everything made sense. Daniel hadn't simply sold our father's house. He had planned it. He had forged documents, sold the property, and then given me a tiny portion of the money to make me believe I had received my share. But why had he been so confident? Daniel has already tried to access my bank accounts without permission, and last month, I discovered that someone withdrew money from my personal account. Jonathan stopped the video. I stared at him. Them. The brothers because Daniel believed your father's old will was still valid. I frowned. What does that mean? Your brother didn't know about the new will. I stared at him. So he sold a house that Dad left to me without knowing Dad had changed the will. Exactly. For the first time since Dad died, I felt something other than grief. I felt anger. But Jonathan wasn't finished. There is one more thing. He opened another envelope. This was delivered to my office 2 days after your father's funeral. Inside was a small USB drive. What is this? Your father left it specifically for you. My hands trembled as I plugged it into Jonathan's computer. A video appeared. Dad was sitting in his study. He looked tired, but his voice was steady. Emily, if you're watching this, I probably didn't get the chance to explain everything. I covered my mouth. Dad continued. Your brother has been lying to me for months. He thinks I don't know about his debts. He thinks he can manipulate me into giving him this house. He paused. I refused. Then Dad said something that made my blood run cold. Daniel has already tried to access my bank accounts without permission. And last month, I discovered that someone withdrew money from my personal account. Jonathan stopped the video. I stared at the screen. Who withdrew it? We don't know yet, he said. I looked back at Dad's frozen image. Then, I noticed something in the background. On the desk behind him was a small black notebook. I remembered that notebook. Dad kept all his important financial information inside it. Jonathan. Yes. Where is that notebook? He looked through the estate inventory. It isn't listed. My heart sank. Daniel has it. We both knew what that meant. Daniel hadn't just sold the house. He may have stolen from Dad while he was still alive. And if the notebook contained account information, passwords, or records of the withdrawals, Daniel had a much bigger problem than a fraudulent house sale. I immediately called my brother. He answered after the third ring. What? Daniel, we need to talk. About what? Dad's house. Silence. Then he laughed. Emily, I already told you. The house is sold. I know. So what's the problem? I spoke to Dad's lawyer. The silence returned. This time, it lasted much longer. What did he tell you? I smiled for the first time. He told me Dad left the house to me. Daniel's breathing changed. That doesn't make sense. It will. You're lying. No, Daniel, I'm not. Then I said the words I knew would frighten him. Jonathan also found the power of attorney you used to sell the house. Daniel suddenly became very quiet, and before hanging up, I heard him whisper, You don't know what you're getting yourself into. The call ended. I looked at Jonathan. What did he mean? Jonathan's expression had changed. I don't know. Then his assistant rushed into the office holding a document. Mr. Miller, we just received this from the county recorder. Jonathan read it. His face went pale. What is it? I asked. He slowly turned the paper toward me. It was a second property transaction. Daniel hadn't sold just my father's house. He had transferred another piece of my father's property to a company that didn't exist, and the transfer had happened 2 weeks before Dad died. I stared at the document on Jonathan's desk. 2 weeks before Dad died? Jonathan nodded, and Daniel signed the transfer. I felt sick. How much property are we talking about? Jonathan turned the page toward me. It was a small piece of land behind my father's house. Dad had bought it years ago and planned to build a workshop there. According to the document, Daniel had transferred ownership to a company called Bennett Holdings, LLC. But who owns this company? Where did we ourselves? That's the problem. We checked the registration, and It was created only 3 weeks before the transfer. My hands went cold. Who registered it? Your brother. Everything suddenly became clear. Daniel had been preparing this long before Dad died. The house was only part of his plan. He had been quietly moving my father's assets into a company he controlled. But there was one thing Daniel hadn't known. Dad had kept copies of everything. Jonathan opened another file. Inside were bank statements, property records, and handwritten notes. Your father was documenting Daniel's actions. I looked at the dates. There were notes from months before his death. Daniel asked me to sell the house again. I refused. Another. Daniel knows about my investments. I believe he's planning something. And then the final note. If anything happens to me, investigate the land transfer. I looked at Jonathan. Dad suspected Daniel might hurt him? I don't think your father was accusing him of that, Jonathan said carefully. But he clearly didn't trust him. I took a deep breath. What can we do? Jonathan's answer surprised me. Nothing. Not yet. Why? Because if we confront Daniel now, he'll know exactly what evidence we have. He leaned forward. We need him to make another mistake. I understood immediately. You want to set a trap? Yes. That afternoon, Jonathan filed an emergency legal notice challenging the sale of my father's house, but we didn't tell Daniel. Instead, Jonathan sent him a formal letter stating that the estate had discovered irregularities in the property transaction and that Daniel would need to provide the original power of attorney and supporting documents. Daniel panicked. Formal letter stating that the estate had discovered irregularities in the property transaction and that Daniel would need to provide the original power of attorney and supporting documents. Daniel panicked. Provide the original power of attorney and supporting documents. Daniel panicked. I stared at the phone. He's moving the property. Yes. And why would he do that? Jonathan's voice became serious. Because he knows we're coming. That night, I couldn't sleep. Then, at 2:13 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. Only 5 words. You should have left it alone. I stared at the screen. Then another message arrived. Because now you're going to lose everything too. I immediately called Jonathan. He answered half asleep. Emily? Daniel just threatened me. There was a long silence. Then Jonathan said, "Don't respond." "Why?" "Because tomorrow morning we're going to court." He paused. "And this time, we're not asking for the house. We're asking for everything Daniel stole from your father." The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse with Jonathan. For the first time since Dad died, I wasn't afraid of Daniel. I was ready. Daniel walked into the courtroom with his attorney, looking confident. He glanced at me and smiled, that same arrogant smile he'd worn when he told me the house was already sold. But this time, he didn't know what we had. The judge reviewed the documents Jonathan had submitted: the forged power of attorney, the original will, the bank records, the property transfer, and finally, the recording of Daniel admitting that he had personally witnessed my father sign the document. Daniel's attorney argued that Daniel had acted in good faith. Then Jonathan stood. "Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Bennett knew the power of attorney was fraudulent." Daniel's face changed. Jonathan played the recording. Daniel's own voice filled the courtroom. "I was there when Dad signed it." Then came my question from the recording. "Why doesn't the signature match his?" And Daniel's silence. The judge looked directly at him. "Mr. Bennett, did you forge this document?" Daniel's attorney immediately objected, but the evidence was already overwhelming. Then Jonathan presented the bank footage. It showed Daniel withdrawing $64,000 from Dad's account while using the same fraudulent power of attorney. Daniel had no explanation. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He presented the records of Bennett Holdings, LLC, the company Daniel had secretly created, the property transfer, the transfer to Daniel's wife, and the financial record showing that the money from the house sale had been moved through several accounts. The judge ordered an immediate freeze on the remaining funds and suspended the property sale. But then something happened that even I hadn't expected. The buyer of my father's house stood up. He told the court that Daniel had approached him months earlier. Not after Dad's death. Months before it. Daniel had already been trying to sell the house while Dad was alive. The buyer had refused because he didn't have proof Daniel owned the property. Daniel had promised him that the paperwork would be taken care of. My heart sank. This wasn't a desperate decision after Dad died. It had been a plan. Daniel had been waiting for the right moment, and now the truth was finally exposed. The court ruled that the sale of the family home was invalid. The land transfer was also reversed. The money Daniel had taken from Dad's accounts was ordered to be returned to the estate. And because the house had been left entirely to me in Dad's final will, ownership was transferred back into my name. Daniel had lost everything he tried to steal. But I wasn't interested in humiliating him. I only wanted my father's home back. 3 months later, I stood in the backyard beneath Dad's old apple tree. The house was quiet. The rooms were empty, but somehow they felt alive again. I found Dad's old height marks on the wall upstairs. I touched the last one. I remembered him standing behind me with a pencil. "Stand straight, Emily." I smiled through my tears. For years, I had believed that home was just a building. But Dad had left me something much bigger. He had left me proof that he knew me. He knew Daniel. And he knew that one day I would need the truth. I eventually sold the house, not because Daniel had forced me to, but because I wanted a fresh start. Before the sale, however, I took one last thing: Dad's old wooden kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten countless dinners together. I kept it in my new home. As for Daniel, he eventually faced criminal charges related to the forged documents and financial theft. His wife left him after discovering that he'd transferred the property into her name without telling her the full truth. And the debts he'd tried to hide eventually caught up with him. A year later, I received one final letter from him. He didn't apologize. He blamed Dad. He blamed me. He even claimed that everything would have been different if I had simply trusted him. I read the letter once. Then I put it away. I didn't answer. because I'd finally learned something important. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying the person who hurt you. Sometimes revenge is simply refusing to let them destroy what someone you loved left behind. Dad had protected me even after he was gone. And when my brother tried to steal my inheritance, the truth protected me too. The house was gone, but Dad's trust in me wasn't. And that was something Daniel could never sell.